In the spring of the year 1900, a small fleet of Greek sponge boats was driven off its usual course by a storm and forced to shelter near a barren, almost uninhabited island called Antikythera, a scrap of rock in the strait between Crete and the Peloponnese that most maps of the time barely bother to label. While they waited out the weather, the captain sent a diver down in the heavy canvas and copper suit that sponge divers of the era used to work the seabed, and the man came back up not with sponges but with a story that sounded, at first, like the kind of thing divers tell to pass the time. An arm, he said, a bronze arm, reaching up out of the sand at the bottom of the sea. What he had actually found, at a depth of around 45 meters off a headland called Point Glyphadia, was the wreck of a Roman-era cargo ship, its hull long since rotted away, its contents scattered and half-buried across the seabed for nearly 2,000 years, an accidental time capsule of Greek luxury goods that had never reached wherever it had originally been sailing. What followed was one of the most dangerous archaeological salvage operations ever undertaken, carried out not by trained archaeologists but by the same sponge divers who happened to be in the area, working under contract to the Greek government through the brutal winter of 1900 into 1901, descending again and again into cold water at a depth that pushed the primitive diving equipment of the period to its absolute limit. They brought up marble and bronze statues, some in pieces, some remarkably intact, glassware, jewelry, coins, and furniture fittings, an astonishing haul that would eventually fill a wing of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The human cost was real and rarely gets mentioned alongside the treasures. One diver died from what was almost certainly decompression sickness, a condition nobody working the site fully understood at the time, and several others were left permanently paralyzed from repeated dives to a depth their bodies simply weren't equipped to handle safely, again and again, for months. Each dive was limited to only a few minutes of actual working time on the seabed before the diver had to be hauled back up, which meant the entire haul, statues, glass, bronze fragments, coins, was recovered a handful of pieces at a time across roughly a year of dangerous, incremental work, with the Greek navy eventually stepping in to help manage the operation once its scale and difficulty became clear. The ship itself, insofar as anything of the hull survived at all, appears to have been a large Roman-era merchant vessel, and the character of its cargo tells its own quiet story. This wasn't a shipment of raw goods or bulk trade commodities, it was luxury freight, sculpture, fine glassware, jewelry, and decorative bronze work, almost certainly gathered from workshops and collections around the Greek world and bound, in all likelihood, for a wealthy buyer or patron somewhere in Italy, part of the broader current of Greek art and craftsmanship flowing steadily toward Rome as the Roman Republic's elite developed an increasingly voracious appetite for Greek culture in the century before the Common Era. Whatever else it was, the wreck was a snapshot of exactly the kind of high-value cultural cargo moving across the Mediterranean at the height of that appetite, which is part of why, when the gearwork inside one corroded lump eventually got noticed, nobody could simply assume it had washed in from somewhere else. It had sailed with everything else, deliberately packed, evidently valuable enough to travel alongside marble philosophers and fine glass bowls. Among the celebrated finds, the bronze youth now known as the Antikythera Mechanism, the marble philosophers, the fine glass bowls, there was also a heap of far less glamorous material, corroded lumps of fused bronze and rotted wood, encrusted almost beyond recognition after 2 millennia underwater. The kind of debris that gets crated up and shipped back mostly because leaving it behind feels wasteful rather than because anyone expects it to matter. Whatever these lumps were, they had clearly stopped being anything identifiable a long time before the ship went down, corrosion and marine growth having fused them into shapeless clumps of green-black material that nobody in 1901, looking at a room full of gorgeous statuary, had any particular reason to examine closely. They went into storage. For the moment, this story is about to slow down and sit inside a museum drawer in Athens, waiting for someone to actually look. That someone was a Greek archaeologist named Valerios Stais, working at the museum in May of 1902, going through the unglamorous backlog of wrecked material that had been sitting largely untouched since the salvage operation ended. Splitting open one of the corroded lumps, or examining a piece where corrosion had already caused it to crack apart on its own, Stais noticed something that made him stop. Embedded in the bronze was what looked, unmistakably, like a gear wheel, with small triangular teeth cut around its edge with real precision. It was such an odd thing to find inside a shipwreck otherwise full of statues and pottery that Stais's first instinct, and the instinct of nearly everyone he showed it to afterward, was suspicion rather than excitement. Gearwork this find simply did not belong, according to everything then understood about ancient technology, in a Greek or Roman shipwreck from roughly the 1st century BCE. The comfortable assumption, repeated for years afterward in various forms, was that it must be some kind of mistake, a later navigational instrument that had somehow ended up mixed in with the ancient cargo, an astrolabe perhaps, dropped by a more recent ship passing over the same wreck site centuries afterward. A German philologist named Albert Rehm took a serious early interest in the object during the following years, recognizing traces of astronomical vocabulary among the faint inscriptions visible on its corroded surfaces and becoming convinced, correctly as it turned out, that the device had something to do with tracking the movements of the sun and moon. Rehm worked on it on and off for decades, corresponding with other scholars, accumulating notes and partial transcriptions, but he never published a complete account of what he'd found, and he died in 1949 with his research still unfinished and largely unshared, a near miss of scholarship that could have moved the whole story forward by half a century had it simply made it into print. For most of the first half of the 20th century, the object language settled on to describe this strange fused lump of gearwork was some version of too advanced for its time, a phrase that sounds like an explanation but is really just a polite way of admitting nobody had yet worked out what they were looking at. Part of the problem, in those early decades, was that nobody had a mental category ready to receive what Stais had found. Ancient Greek technology, as it was understood by scholars at the turn of the 20th century, meant architecture, sculpture, philosophy, and, at its most mechanical, fairly simple devices like water clocks, catapults, and screw pumps, impressive in their own right but nothing approaching the interlocking precision of the object now sitting in the museum's storage. A gear train this find implied tools, standards, and an entire manufacturing culture of instrument making that the historical record, as it stood in 1902, simply didn't seem to have room for. Rather than force a rewrite of that whole picture based on one corroded artifact, most of the scholarly world quietly filed the object under exception, curiosity, or possible error, and moved on to the statues, which is precisely how something this extraordinary managed to sit half-forgotten in plain sight for the better part of a century. It took a Yale historian of science named Derek de Solla Price to drag the mystery back into serious daylight, beginning around 1951 and continuing, with real obsession, for the next 2 decades of his career. Price recognized immediately that cracking the object open physically, the obvious way to see what gears lay hidden beneath layers of corrosion, would be an act of destruction no responsible researcher could justify on something this irreplaceable, so he went looking for a way to see inside without touching it. Working with a Greek nuclear physicist named Charalampos Karakalos, Price used gamma-ray and X-ray radiography in 1971, essentially the same underlying principle as a hospital X-ray, to photograph the internal structure of the corroded fragments from the outside, layer by layer, without cracking a single piece further open. What came back on those film plates was staggering. Nested gear trains stacked several layers deep inside lumps of bronze that, from the outside, looked like nothing more than shapeless corroded metal, evidence of a mechanism dramatically more complex than the single visible gear stays had spotted 70 years earlier. Price published his findings in 1974 in a monograph called Gears from the Greeks, proposing that the object was a kind of calendar computer, a geared device for tracking astronomical cycles, and while several of his specific gear counts and functional details would later be revised or overturned by researchers with better imaging technology, his core insight, that this was a genuine mechanical calculator built by Greek craftsmen roughly 2,000 years before anyone thought such a thing was possible, broke the intellectual logjam that had kept the object filed under unexplained curiosity for 7 decades. It's worth pausing on how strange that moment must have felt, seeing, for the first time on a radiograph, that the corroded lump sitting in a museum drawer wasn't debris at all, but the fossilized skeleton of a machine, gear meshed against gear, exactly where a Greek engineer had placed them sometime before the birth of Christ. Price's radiographs were good enough to prove the mechanism's staggering complexity, but nowhere near good enough to map it completely, and for the next 3 decades progress crept forward in increments, competing partial reconstructions, ongoing disagreement over exactly how many gears the device had originally contained, and a real risk that the object would simply remain a famous, half-understood curiosity indefinitely. That changed in 2005, when a research collaboration called the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, led by Cardiff University's Tony Freeth and Mike Edmonds, brought together astronomers, mathematicians, papyrologists, and, crucially, 2 very different pieces of cutting-edge imaging technology, in an effort to finally see the whole thing at once, inside and out, without moving a single fragment. Hewlett-Packard contributed a technique called polynomial texture mapping, developed by researcher Tom Malzbender, which photographs a surface under dozens of different raking light angles and mathematically combines the results to reveal engraved text so worn and shallow it's effectively invisible to the naked eye under any single lighting condition. X-Tech Systems, a British industrial imaging company, went considerably further, shipping an 8-ton microfocus X-ray computed tomography scanner, nicknamed Blade Runner by the engineers who operated it, into the National Archaeological Museum itself so the 82 known fragments never had to leave the building. The scanner built full 3-dimensional X-ray models of each fragment's internal structure, gear by gear, tooth by tooth, at a level of resolution that finally let researchers count, measure, and trace the actual gear trains hidden inside the bronze rather than inferring them from flat, overlapping radiograph shadows the way Price had been forced to decades earlier. Getting that scanner into position at all was its own small logistical feat, since a machine built for inspecting jet turbine blades and industrial castings was never designed with a 2,000-year-old, irreplaceable Greek artifact in mind. Each fragment had to be mounted with extraordinary care, rotated slowly through the scanner's beam to build up a full volumetric image slice by slice, a process that for the largest and most complex fragments took many hours of scanning to complete. The resulting data sets were so dense, effectively a complete 3-dimensional map of hidden internal geometry that no human eye had seen since the mechanism was originally assembled, that researchers were still extracting new detail from them years after the actual scanning sessions in Athens had wrapped up and the scanner itself had been packed up and shipped home. If the sheer improbability of finding a functioning gear train inside a 2,000-year-old shipwreck has already got your mind quietly drifting, this is a natural point to hit subscribe, because what the scanner revealed next is the part of the story that turned this from a curious relic into something historians now routinely call the world's oldest known analog computer. What emerged from the CT data was a device containing at least 30 surviving gears, cut from bronze sheet by hand, some no larger than a fingernail, with teeth spaced at a precision that modern engineers examining the data still find genuinely difficult to explain given the tools available in antiquity. Based on the surviving gear train's internal logic, researchers estimate the complete original mechanism likely held around 37 gears in total, meaning a meaningful fraction of it, along with an unknown number of the 82 recovered fragments missing neighbors, is either lost to corrosion, still sitting on the seabed near Antikythera, or was never recovered from the wreck at all. Layered across the surviving fragments, the imaging also recovered roughly 3,400 characters of tiny inscribed Greek text, covering the mechanism's outer plates like an instruction manual, describing dial functions, color-coded warnings, and operating notes clearly intended for whoever actually used the device rather than for the craftsman who built it. So what did all of this hand-cut bronze actually do? The front face carried a large dial combining two concentric rings, an outer one marked with the 12 signs of the zodiac and an inner one marked with the 365 days of the Egyptian civil calendar, the inner ring built to rotate slightly relative to the outer one so the whole device could be recalibrated to absorb the extra quarter day that Egyptian calendars otherwise drifted by each year. Pointers swept across this dial to indicate the position of the sun and, on a separate hand, the position of the moon, while a small rotating ball, painted half black and half silvered, turned inside a subsidiary opening to display the moon's current phase in a way that would have been immediately, intuitively readable to anyone glancing at it, no numbers or Greek literacy required. The lunar pointer alone hides one of the mechanism's cleverest tricks. The moon doesn't move across the sky at a constant speed, its orbit is elliptical, so it appears to speed up and slow down slightly over the course of each month, an irregularity that Greek astronomers, very possibly following the work of the 2nd century BCE astronomer Hipparchus of Rhodes, had worked out mathematically well before this device was built. To physically reproduce that variable speed using nothing but gears, the mechanism's designer built in a small pin and slot arrangement, one gear riding slightly off-center from another so that as they rotate together, the output speed genuinely, mechanically speeds up and slows down in step with the moon's real motion. An early and remarkably elegant solution to a problem engineers wouldn't seriously revisit again for over 1,000 years. Turn the device over and the back reveals two large spiral dials, wound around themselves like a nautilus shell to fit an enormous span of time into a compact space. The upper spiral tracks the Metonic cycle, the 19-year, 235 lunar month pattern after which the solar and lunar calendars realign almost exactly, with a smaller subsidiary dial nested inside it tracking the Callippic cycle, a refinement across 76 years, for Metonic cycles, that corrects a small residual drift the 19-year cycle alone doesn't quite catch. The lower spiral is, if anything, even more remarkable, it tracks the Saros cycle, 223 lunar months, roughly 18 years and 11 days, after which the Sun, Moon, and Earth return closely enough to the same relative geometry that solar and lunar eclipses repeat in a predictable, if not perfectly identical, pattern. Tiny inscribed glyphs along this dial mark out which months to expect an eclipse, at roughly what hour, and in some cases even hint at expected severity, essentially a 2,000-year-old eclipse prediction table, mechanically encoded rather than written out as a list, with its own subsidiary exeligmos dial correcting for the 8-hour offset that accumulates across each Saros cycle. And then, tucked among all this serious astronomical machinery, sits something almost charmingly out of place, a dial tracking not celestial cycles but the 4-year rotation of the great Panhellenic athletic festivals, Olympia, Nemea, Isthmia, and Pythia among them, the same circuit of games that included the ancient Olympics themselves. It's a small detail that quietly tells you something about who this object was actually built for, not a temple priesthood cloistered away with celestial secrets, but very possibly a wealthy, educated individual who wanted to track eclipses and the game's calendar on the very same instrument, treating cosmic order and civic life as part of one continuous, trackable rhythm. The eclipse glyphs on the lower spiral dial reward close attention too, because they're not simply marking which months to watch the sky. Each inscribed glyph carries a compact code, noting the expected hour of the eclipse, whether it would be visible as the sun or moon rose or set, and in a number of cases what researchers interpret as a rough forecast of severity or even color, the kind of reddish cast a deeply eclipsed moon sometimes takes on. Producing predictions this specific required real predictive astronomy layered on top of the mechanical gearing itself, meaning whoever compiled the underlying eclipse data that got encoded into this dial had access to generations of careful observational record-keeping, almost certainly inherited from Babylonian astronomers, who had been tracking the Saros cycle and its eclipse patterns for centuries before any Greek engineer thought to render that knowledge in bronze. Binding the whole system together is a gearing arrangement researchers now describe as genuinely differential in function, a set of gears that combines two separate rotational inputs, roughly speaking the sun's motion and the moon's motion, into a single combined output representing their relative difference, which is what actually produces the moon's phase display on the front dial. Differential gearing of this kind is the same underlying principle used in a modern car's rear axle, letting the two wheels turn at different speeds through a corner, and for a long time in the history of engineering it was assumed to be a 19th century invention. Working out that the Antikythera Mechanism had quietly beaten that assumption by roughly 2,000 years, largely credited to the meticulous reconstruction work of horologist Michael Wright in the early 2000s, is a big part of why historians now reach for the word computer rather than calendar when they describe what this object actually was. Knowing what the device did still leaves open the considerably harder question of who actually built it, and here the trail runs through the writings of the Roman statesman Cicero rather than through any surviving signature or workshop mark, because the mechanism itself carries neither. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes a bronze device built by Archimedes that modeled the motions of the sun, moon, and planets, seized as war spoils by the Roman general Marcellus after the brutal 212 BCE siege of Syracuse and kept afterward as a treasured family heirloom rather than melted down like most captured bronze. Cicero adds that a Roman statesman named Gaius Sulpicius Gallus later used this same device, or one very much like it, to explain the mechanics of a solar eclipse to an audience, and mentions in passing that the philosopher and astronomer Posidonius of Rhodes was known to have built a similar instrument of his own. The shipwreck that carried this particular mechanism has been dated, from its coin evidence and pottery, to somewhere around 70 to 60 BCE, decades after Archimedes died at Syracuse in 212 BCE, so this specific surviving object can't literally be his personal device, whatever else it might be. What Cicero's account does strongly suggest is that this wasn't a one-of-a-kind freak invention at all, but a known, if rare, category of instrument, a tradition of Greek-geared cosmic models stretching back at least to Archimedes' generation, of which this corroded shipwreck find happens to be the only physical example anyone has ever actually recovered. Linguistic analysis of the calendar month names inscribed on the mechanism, carried out by scholars including Alexander Jones, points toward a Corinthian-derived calendar system, the kind used in Corinth itself and in Corinthian colonies scattered from Syracuse in Sicily to Epirus in northwestern Greece, while a separate and long-favored theory points to the island of Rhodes, a genuine center of both astronomy and precision mechanical engineering in this period, home for a time to Hipparchus himself and later to the very Posidonius that Cicero names directly. Rhodes makes an especially tempting candidate once you look at what else the island was known for in this exact period. This was a small, wealthy island city-state that had built its reputation and its economy on maritime trade, and it invested heavily in return in scholarship, engineering, and public spectacle to match, home to the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and to a documented tradition of building large mechanical devices for public display, including elaborate siege engines whose construction is independently recorded by ancient historians. A society already comfortable commissioning enormous bronze statues and complex siege machinery, and simultaneously home to some of the era's most advanced observational astronomers, is exactly the kind of environment where the specific cross-disciplinary skill set this mechanism required, precision metalworking married to serious mathematical astronomy, would have had the best chance of actually meeting inside one workshop, or one gifted individual's career. No workshop, no signed name, no definitive answer has ever surfaced, and honestly, given how thoroughly the fragments have now been scanned inside and out, it's unlikely one ever will. What happens next in this story is really the absence of a story, and it might be the single strangest part of the whole mystery. Nothing else even approaching this level of geared mechanical complexity shows up anywhere in the surviving historical or archaeological record for well over 1,000 years afterward. The next comparably sophisticated geared instruments researchers can point to are things like an early 13th century geared calendar built in the Islamic world, attributed to an engineer named Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr of Isfahan, and, later still, elaborate European astronomical clocks such as Giovanni da Dondi's Astrarium, completed in the mid-14th century in Padua. Somewhere between the 1st century BCE and the 13th century CE, roughly 13 or 1400 years, either the specific technical knowledge required to design and cut gearing this fine was lost outright, or it survived in some quieter, less durable form, wood rather than bronze, private workshop apprenticeship rather than published treatise, that simply never left a trace anyone has managed to find. Nobody knows which of those explanations is closer to the truth, and it's genuinely hard to overstate how uncomfortable that gap is once you sit with it. Bronze, unlike stone or fired clay, is endlessly recyclable, and a huge amount of ancient bronze work, statues, instruments, tools, seems to have simply been melted down for its metal value across centuries of wars, economic pressure, and shifting fashion, which alone could explain why no second Antikythera Mechanism has ever turned up despite Cicero's account implying several once existed. It's equally possible the underlying mathematical and mechanical knowledge required to build one quietly dissolved along with the specific individuals who understood it, in a world where technical expertise this specialized often lived inside one workshop, one teacher, one family line, with no guarantee it ever got written down in a form later readers could reconstruct even if the text itself happened to survive. There's also a simpler, less dramatic possibility worth sitting with, that devices like this one were never common to begin with, even at the height of whatever tradition produced them. Cicero's account describes this style of instrument as something worth mentioning specifically because it was rare and impressive, an heirloom-grade curiosity passed down through one particular Roman family rather than an everyday tool sitting in ordinary workshops across the Greek world. If only a handful of these mechanisms were ever built in the first place, each one requiring the kind of rare cross-disciplinary expertise that combined advanced mathematical astronomy with precision metalworking in a single individual or workshop, then losing the tradition wouldn't have required some catastrophic single event at all, just the ordinary, unremarkable death of the last few people who happened to know how, with nobody else positioned to inherit the specific combination of skills required to carry it forward. The wreck site itself hasn't finished giving up its secrets either. A research effort called Return to Antikythera, led by marine archaeologist Brendan Foley working with Lund University and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, has been diving the site using modern rebreather technology since 2012, recovering additional bronze fragments, statue pieces, and, in 2016, a set of human skeletal remains, nicknamed Pamphilos by the team, well enough preserved that researchers attempted to extract ancient DNA directly from the bones, a young man who drowned alongside this cargo and never got the chance to know what he'd been carrying. The site is deep, unstable, and was damaged decades ago by illegal dynamite fishing in the area, and researchers remain genuinely uncertain how much material, possibly including some of the mechanism's missing original gears, might still be sitting scattered across the seabed, waiting on a future expedition with better tools than the ones available today. Even the fragments already sitting safely in the Athens Museum keep yielding new findings as imaging technology keeps improving around them. Researchers led by Tony Freeth have spent recent years analyzing the tiny, individually hand-punched holes ringing the mechanism's calendar dial, each one carrying minuscule imperfections in spacing that, run through careful statistical reconstruction, can be used to estimate the ring's original full diameter and total hole count even where large sections of it no longer survive physically. That analysis has pointed toward a calendar start date sometime around 205 or 204 BCE, a conclusion built almost entirely out of the accumulated tiny irregularities of a craftsman's hand punching holes into bronze over 2,000 years ago, a small, almost tender kind of evidence, and a reminder that this device is still actively giving something up, one careful measurement at a time. More than a century after Valerio Stays first noticed a single gear tooth catching the light in a museum drawer. So here, honestly, is where the story has to leave you. We know, with real mechanical confidence now, more or less exactly what this object did: tracked the sun, the moon's true irregular motion, the 19-year lunar-solar calendar cycle, the 18-year eclipse cycle, and even the 4-year rotation of the Panhellenic Games, all bound together through gearing, including a genuine differential mechanism, that nobody expected the ancient world to have been capable of building. What we still don't know, and may simply never know for certain, is the name of the person who designed it, the workshop where it was actually cut and assembled, and above all, why a tradition capable of producing something this sophisticated seems to have gone almost completely silent for the next 1400 years, leaving this one corroded, storm-scattered shipwreck as the only surviving proof it ever existed at all.